If you're a landscape photographer that currently uses a Panasonic S5 Mark I, you will already know that it is a wonderful camera which produces beautiful results for landscape photography. However, part of you might be wondering if you should upgrade to the new Panasonic S5 Mark II. Is it worth the upgrade? Well, I'm going to cut to the chase and save you a bit of time. The reality is no, it isn't. However, if you use the camera for other things as well, it gets a little bit more complicated. And that's what I'm going to cover in this video. So let's start with the most important thing, and that has to be image quality. The reality is the difference between this Mark II and the Mark I is basically very little. They both produce beautiful results. Although if I was to actually state a preference, I would actually probably go for the Mark I. And I don't know why, there's no basis on that. I feel like I've got nicer photos with the Mark I, but that could just be to do with the conditions. But the reality is, if you're looking to upgrade just for image quality, the reality is there's very little difference and the Mark I will do you just fine. Now if we look at the ergonomics of the Panasonic S5 Mark II, they are very similar to the Mark I. I think it's a little bit chunkier. I think it feels like the grip's a little bit bigger. It's slightly heavier. I think if we look at the specs, I think it will sort of back this up, that the size is slightly larger, slightly heavier. And a lot of this is to sort of accommodate the fan underneath here for video purposes. But all in all, it's not a deal breaker. But again, if I was using it just solely for landscape photography, I would say go for the Mark I, simply because it's a touch lighter and just a touch smaller. And ultimately that means a little bit more space in your bag. But it's by no means a deal breaker. But as I just mentioned there, the S5 Mark II is definitely a far better video camera, hence why it's got the fans in to help it cool when shooting 4K. So ultimately, one of the biggest differences between the S5 Mark II and the S5 Mark I is definitely video. Now at the moment I've switched to the S5 Mark II to record this bit so you can actually see how well it works and what the actual footage looks like. And also to give you an idea of how well it tracks. Now to be honest, I never really minded the Mark I autofocus. Yes, it wasn't very quick, it wasn't 100% reliable, and the Mark II is definitely a lot better. But also, I have to say, it's not Sony level of better. It's very good, you know, it is superb and you probably won't have a problem with it, but I have used it for filming some wedding videos, and there has been a couple of times when it has actually lost focus off the bride and groom standing right in front of me and sort of drifted a little bit, then come back. So it's not perfect. Yes, considerably better than the Mark I, but still not Sony level. Now, keeping on the subject of autofocus, the Panasonic S5 Mark II has phase detect autofocus, as opposed to the Mark I, which had contrast detect. Now, what does this mean for the landscape photographer? And the reality is very little. I used to find the autofocus on the Mark I more than adequate for landscapes. However, I use this camera for weddings and commercial jobs and stuff like that. And there's no denying that as soon as you get into a low light situation, this does focus a lot better. It's a lot snappier. And with the old Mark I used to feel like it was a little bit of a lag while it locked focus, and this is pretty much instantaneous. However, I also used to find the Mark I was very, very accurate. And I don't find the Mark II to be quite as accurate. I have more slightly misfocused shots. But you know, I would prefer to have a slightly misfocused shot of the moment as opposed to no shot at all at the moment. So really, if you're using it for anything moving, then I think really that is a good reason to upgrade. But again, for landscape photography, really there's just no need. So really, so far, everything I've covered that's better about this camera really doesn't apply to landscape photography. But there is one thing which is better, which is definitely a help for landscape photography, and that's the EVF. The EVF is improved, and that's lovely. That's one thing that I do really like about this camera, is this admittedly slightly better, but better nonetheless, EVF. But again, for me, that wouldn't be a good enough reason to want to upgrade to the Mark II from the Mark I, but it is definitely something to consider. Ultimately though, I think probably the biggest reason not to upgrade is simply the cost. Because for the extra, I think roughly about £600–700 between the Mark 1 and the Mark 2, and I've seen some used Mark 1s go for like crazy prices, like mint ones for like 650, so that's something to keep in mind, and that's buying from a shop. As opposed to this is what? Basically a £2 camera with the 20-6 kit lens. I think there's a big price difference there, and what I would say is don't upgrade to the Mark 1, just get yourself another lens, you know, maybe pick up another wide or pick up a telephoto. Just keep your Mark 1 and invest in glass. It's always a good move to invest in the glass. So it's really hard to justify recommending this as a good upgrade from the Mark 1, simply because the Mark 1 is such a good camera. Okay, future me is going to jump in at this point, simply because a couple of days after filming the original video, Panasonic announced a new firmware update for the Panasonic S5 Mark II. Now it seems that a lot of the new features with this update seems to be based around the high resolution mode. For example, you can now take 8 seconds per single shot for the high resolution mode. So that basically means that it takes a sequence of shots and stitches them all together to create one big file. Well, each single exposure can now be 8 seconds, which could be amazing if you want to do sort of really extreme long exposures. And it also brings to the table a new handheld high-res mode, which could be interesting if you're using the S5 Mark II solely handheld as opposed to on a tripod. But to be honest, I don't think this firmware update has actually changed my final opinion on whether you should upgrade from the Mark 1 to the Mark II. I think all I would say is if you are shooting your camera handheld a lot of the time, so if you're doing a lot of handheld landscape photography, then the S5 Mark II does suddenly make better sense, simply because of the improved autofocus and the fact you can now do handheld high resolution shots. However, if you're putting the camera on a tripod, honestly I'm still struggling to see a reason of why you should go for the Mark II over the Mark 1, with the exception perhaps being the EVF. But of course this is solely my opinion, and your requirements may be different to mine, and you may find the Mark II definitely worth the upgrade. But if you don't already own an S5 Mark 1, what I would say is that the S5 Mark II is undoubtedly a fantastic hybrid camera. The video quality is stunning, the photo quality is stunning, and really it's, for the money, it is a brilliant all-in-one. It's just not worth the upgrade from the Mark 1, that's the problem. As a standalone camera, Mark II is a wonderful camera and I wouldn't be without mine. But if I already owned the Mark 1 and I was looking to upgrade again, I'm not sure I would do it. I'm not sure if I'd just stick with the Mark 1, especially if I only shoot landscapes. Anyway guys, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've got something from it. If you have, please give it a thumbs up, maybe subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and I'll see you again soon for another one. Thanks for watching.